Every now and then, a game pops up seemingly out of nowhere to almost universal acclaim, often starting from humble beginnings to become a genuine phenomenon. That is certainly what happened in the case of Hollow Knight, the little indie darling that could. Beginning its life as an idea left over after a game jam back in 2013, Hollow Knight was officially announced via Kickstarter a year later, and after making a sum of over $57,000, the game went into development. It was officially released in 2017 for PC and Mac, and consoles a year later, and it was a resounding success. As of February of 2019, Hollow Knight has sold over 2.8 million copies. This game is absolutely adored by many, with plenty of people calling it their favorite game of all time. But until now, I had never experienced it myself. So when it was included as one of the free games for PS Plus members in November of 2020, I figured I had to give it a shot, even though I knew it was from a genre that I absolutely despise. That's right, I hate Metroidvania games. As someone who doesn't like platformers at the best of times and has absolutely no sense of direction, this genre has always been one that has had zero appeal to me. So I went in knowing Hollow Knight had an uphill battle to fight in order to win me over. The question being, was it successful? Partially. I've never had such a strong love-hate relationship with a game before. Let's get into why. First, I'll explain my distaste for Metroidvanias. As I said, I don't really enjoy platforming, and that is one of the primary aspects of this genre. I will admit that I tend to prefer 2D platformers over 3D, but not to a large enough degree that I'm thrilled to play through any platforming section. If I absolutely must partake in platforming, I'd at least like it to be a one and done deal. That way I just have to grit my teeth and get through it once and then never have to think about it again. With Metroidvania games, that almost never happens. You always have to retread ground, and if that ground happens to have some platforms over it, you better believe that means you gotta keep doing the same hops, dashes, and wall jumps over and over again. To me, this gets really old really fast, and the more often I have to traverse through a particularly tricky location, the more it brings the experience as a whole down for me. And then there are platforming challenges that are meant to really test your mastery over a game's controls, and the traversal methods at your disposal that drive me to want to slam myself headfirst into a wall of spikes in real life. Hollow Knight absolutely has these as well, and I will talk about that place soon enough. The second thing that makes a Metroidvania is the exploration. Going from location to location, checking every single nook and cranny for secrets, collectibles, abilities, and upgrades. This is something that on paper I like the idea of, but in practice has never been something that has really had a strong appeal for me. It's not that I hate searching for secrets per se, but I am really bad at it. I tend to overlook things in the environment constantly, so I usually have to either spend hours hitting every single wall and ceiling, or just resort to a guide. Which I'm not ashamed to admit I did because good Lord, there is so much stuff in this game. I really dig the amount of content present here. It actually really caught me off guard how much was crammed into this one package, if I'm being honest. But as far as my personal enjoyment goes, there is definitely an upper limit to the amount of things you have to find lying around. Getting grubs and charms was pretty fun for a while. Getting the combined total of 86 or 91, depending on how you want to count them, was tedious by the late game, mostly because of how much of the map I had to go back and forth over to get everything. Now, I might not have such a distaste for this style of gameplay if it wasn't for two things. my absolutely abysmal sense of direction that meant I had to have a charm notch almost permanently occupied by the wayward compass, and the nature of how this genre handles abilities and progression. I understand that finding new abilities that can help you traverse the game world in new or easier ways is a fundamental aspect of this genre, and is vital for providing a sense of achievement as well as proper pacing. But I absolutely cannot stand when I find a little secret or make my way to an area just to realize that I don't have the right ability to proceed. It means I have to remember where the thing was and exactly what I needed to bypass it just so I can backtrack to it later. That to me just isn't fun, especially when such a block is found after a particularly difficult section of combat or platforming. There were at least a few occasions where I stumbled upon something a little too early and overcame platforming sections I found particularly challenging, only to realize I couldn't reach my reward because I lacked the right ability. It just felt like I was being punished for trying and succeeding to do something before the game wanted me to. Now, I want it understood that most of what I just said is my pre-existing bias against this particular genre of games. And I knew these were things that were going to bother me going into this. So I am going to try to not include the majority of these grievances in my actual overall opinion of this particular game, though my bias may still color my overall experience. Good? Good. Now let's actually talk about Hollow Knight and everything I loved about it. Most obvious off the bat was the art style. This game is beautiful. I love the designs of the characters, even though they're all horrible, filthy insects, and the world itself is lovingly crafted. The biggest gripe I have with it is that some sections can feel a little samey, such as parts of Green Path and Queen's Gardens, which are both full of thorns and acid. And that really doesn't affect my experience as a whole, except for causing me to take a wrong path here and there. Though, again, that's probably mostly due to my own inability to navigate anything more complex than an intersection. Everything in this game just oozes style, and even the simplest character and creature designs are crafted with purpose. And speaking of crafted with purpose, the soundtrack is absolutely masterful. Christopher Larkin went wild with this soundtrack. There is not one bad track throughout, and most of them are just mwah. The music sets the tone wonderfully for every battle, every event, and almost every location will get to you! Seriously, even if you have no interest in this game whatsoever, I'd still recommend giving the OST at least one solid listen to. It is a true work of art. In fact, the world as a whole is a work of art. I don't want to spoil this game too much, so I'm not going to go into too many details, but the history of Hallownest is fascinating, and every scrap of lore you find about it adds to the bigger picture. It's a beautiful, tragic world, and that tragedy seeps over to many of the characters you encounter. There are very, very few truly happy endings for many of the residents of this world. And there's something oddly appealing about that. It's a bleak, bleak world, and try as you might to counter that, there's only so much that can be done to truly improve the world at large. But what hope you can bring into it feels so much brighter when you compare it to how the world was when you first arrived. It really feels like you have an impact on the world around you, even if that world feels a little emptier by the time you're done with your journey. Uncovering the history of Hallownest and learning what you can of its inhabitants, both past and present, is often very rewarding and endlessly interesting, but it is not always easy. The challenge of uncovering it all is something that is sort of a mixed bag for me. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind games being hard, and I don't think a game needs to have a difficulty slider or anything like that. If a game is crafted in such a way as to make a very purposeful experience for the player, then I think it's fine if it's a genuine challenge. That said, games that are hard for the sake of being hard to the point of taking the piss are something that I will absolutely never enjoy. I like a challenge, but I want it to at least feel like it's reasonably fair. There is a fine line between a difficult but rewarding challenge and bullshit designed to turn controllers and keyboards into endangered species. Hollow Knight often uses that line like a jump rope. The main game itself is very challenging to start, and can be downright unforgiving for the unprepared. But with enough perseverance, it absolutely can be overcome, with only some points of moderate frustration along the way. With enough patience, practice, and exploration, most challenges can be met or even made trivial. Part of overcoming many of these challenges is using the charms. And while it may be aggravating to acquire all of them, they were one of my favorite elements of this game. Trying out all the different charms themselves was fun enough, but the charm combinations are what made them stand out. Getting a powerful charm combination set up and using it effectively was super satisfying, and they made the endgame significantly less frustrating. For any who might be curious, my favorite combination was Unbreakable Strength, Quick Slash, Long Nail, and Sharp Shadow, because I favor a heavily offensive fighting style focused on causing as much damage as possible, as quickly as possible, and face tanking when I know I can afford it. And I needed Unbreakable Strength because, frankly, I died a lot. You see, these charms allow you to build your character in so many different ways to suit so many different playstyles. And even the ones that seem like filler at face value have some practical use. Finding those uses is one of the most enjoyable aspects of this game in my opinion. I just wish those practical uses weren't mostly just reducing the pain that this game could often cause. Unfortunately, that's all I well and truly loved about this game, and my adoration has to turn more critical here. The combat is where a large amount of this game's challenge comes from. While most of the enemies you encounter either are not a huge threat or can be handled pretty easily with enough practice, combat as a whole is very unforgiving. Any hit on you takes away a mask of health, and for the most part the only way to get that mask back is by spending soul. The main way you get soul is by hitting enemies, and healing takes time and leaves you vulnerable. You can also use soul to cast offensive spells, but in my case I found myself healing far more often than I ever used any spells. At its core, this system is perfectly fine. Healing has an element of risk and reward to it, as do most of your actions. The combat itself is pretty simplistic. You can hit enemies by attacking the 4 cardinal directions with aerial attacks aimed downwards, causing you to pogo if they connect. Different spells also have their uses depending on the direction of the enemies, and can be extremely powerful if used right. Learn enemy patterns, don't get hit. See? Simple. What isn't simple is the nuance surrounding the combat. While your base actions are easy enough to understand, mastering how to use them effectively can be a very daunting task. You often have to be very fast with your actions and reactions if you want to minimize the amount of damage you take, and this is often easier said than done. In my case, I found myself often making easily avoidable mistakes because I would get the timing or direction of my action wrong, or just do the wrong one altogether. This combat system is extremely reactionary, and I'm often very bad at reacting to the right thing at the right time, especially when there is too much happening on the screen at once or things are just moving too quickly. And very often, there would be a great deal of things happening at once, very quickly. So let's talk about the bosses. Hollow Knight's bosses are an integral part of the experience, adding challenge, lore, tension, and so much more to the game. Some are very enjoyable to fight. Some are less so. some make me want to chuck every copy of this game into the sun. My favorite bosses were the ones that I could really learn the patterns of that could still provide a decent challenge. Ones that weren't complete pushovers, but also didn't bully me into submission every time I encountered them. But there were two in particular that I absolutely hated with a passion. And this is as good a time as any to get into the things I hated about this game. So, official spoiler warning now. The Watcher Knights can eat every square inch of my ass. This boss is actually 6 mini-bosses in a trench coat, and you have to fight them all in one go. Their attacks are not the most difficult to avoid, and they leave themselves open often enough to get some good hits in. What makes them bullshit is that you have to fight 2 at a time throughout most of the fight. Dealing with more than one enemy at a time in this game is often difficult enough. But these roly-poly rejects don't even have the decency to both be on screen at the same time. This, coupled with their unsynchronized attacks, makes it exceptionally difficult to see what attack is coming and to react in time to it. And all too often, when you react to one, the other will show up and blindside you, taking away some health. And health is something that you absolutely need in this fight, since you have to take on all the knights with almost no time to heal at all, even with quick focus. Their attacks are just too fast, too relentless, and too difficult to see or predict. I bashed my head against this boss several times and got nowhere. I even made the fight easier by dropping a chandelier on one of them, so I only had to fight 5. But that didn't help. So I had to give up and come back later on. Losing over and over again was bad enough, but what really discouraged me from dusting myself off and trying again was the trek back to the boss. And this is something I hated about every boss I fought. Look, I don't care if you're Hollow Knight, or Dark Souls, or Bloodborne, or whatever. Having to go back through the same locations and enemies over and over again to get from your respawn point to the boss that just killed you is not fun, and it actively discourages trying again. It's something I really hate. Hollow Knight at least has Dream Gate, so you can set up a teleport point wherever you want. But I didn't have that ability when I tried fighting this boss, so that didn't help. All I could do was try going to other places first and coming back with better gear. And by the time I did come back, I had acquired so many upgrades, charms, and abilities that I was able to steamroll them. But for a boss that can be encountered relatively early in this adventure, this was a huge roadblock. And it was the first point where I considered quitting this game entirely, as they are not an optional boss if you want to actually finish the game. But on the topic of optional, I now want to talk about my least favorite boss, Grim. I've read enough comments and message board replies to know that there are plenty of people who really like this boss, or thought he was super easy or super sexy for some fucking reason, but dear God, I cannot for the life of me get a proper grip on him. His sheer speed and the rate at which he can fill the screen with hazards just destroys me. The first time I beat him, I only managed by cheesing him with a ton of spell-focused charms and spamming Abyss Shriek underneath him, and even then it was close. His second form, the Nightmare King, is exactly what it says on the tin. He is an absolute nightmare, and I despise everything about him. This is the kind of boss I do not consider a rewarding challenge, but rather a load of bullshit to be avoided at all costs. At no point during any of my fights with Grim did I have any fun. And honestly, I can say the same about pretty much everything that was introduced with the Grim Troop content pack. The only things I liked about the Grim Troop was their aesthetic and being able to get unbreakable charms through Divine. That's it. I didn't enjoy chasing down the flames for Grim, and I violently hated him. And speaking of violent hate, the White Palace exists. Sadly, random spikes falling from the ceiling, random pits of spikes opening up on the ground below you, and precision jumps are not all the platforming perils that must be endured. Though I would like to argue that those first two at least are honestly just really bad game design. Seriously, they're not fun, they don't add any interesting challenge, they're outdated gotcha moments that I don't think belong in games anymore at all. Can developers stop putting these in games, please? It drives me crazy every time I see them, and it just makes me want to stop playing. I really hate them that much. But, sorry. Anyway, Hollow Knight, like so many other platformers, just has to have a challenge section that goes out of its way to break the player. If you really like platformers, and you love testing your skill or showing off your mastery of a game's mechanics, you probably love this place. And if that's the case, good for you. But for people of normal or substandard skill, or people like me who just don't like platforming, this is the place where Satan is going to go when he dies. This hellscape of saws and spears makes you fight for every single inch of ground. I would say it's trial and error taken up to a ridiculous degree, but unless you have just the right charms equipped, even trial and error won't get you through this, as every mistake is severely punished. If it wasn't for certain skips that let you bypass some of the more agonizing sections, I honestly don't think I would have ever gotten through this. And the music being so pretty and calming doesn't even help anything when it's being interrupted by the constant whir of saw blades or the sounds of spears shooting out of the walls. And when I'm about to rage, the last thing I want is some calming, pretty music to remind me I'm getting mad over a video game. I feel like Rip and Tear would have been a better backing track for this hell. The White Palace almost broke me. It made me want to cry. It made me rage. It made me laugh at the sheer absurdity of the task before me. It made me contemplate all my life choices that led me to this point. But I persevered, and I triumphed over it. And when I did I feel accomplished? No. No, I only felt relieved. Relieved because I knew it was something that I would never have to do again. Reaching the corpse of the Pale King did not fill me with elation or make me feel empowered. I just felt exhausted, drained from the effort of my achievement. Is the White Palace the most difficult platforming challenge of all time?
The law requires that I answer no.
And most terrifyingly of all, it's not even the hardest thing this game has to offer. That dubious honor goes to everything provided by the content pack known as Godmaster. Mother of God, I hate Godmaster. This content pack added Godhome, which is mostly just a bunch of boss rush arenas prettied up as pantheons. I don't like boss rushes as a rule. One boss at a time, fine. I can smash my head against it as many times as it takes to make things click. But numerous bosses in a row with a limited time to heal, minimal rest points, and no option to change out your equipped items to suit fighting a particular boss that's just one of many? That's sadistic. And that's just the easier pantheons. The Pantheon of Hollownest is the single most insulting thing I have ever attempted. Having to fight a stronger version of every boss in the game, many of which are in modified arenas to make fighting even harder, is not fun. I don't care that it is technically optional content. There is a whole ending tied behind this absolute migraine given form. And when something like that is locked behind a challenge, I don't consider that challenge optional. No, this doesn't just cross the line of being a rewarding challenge. This is where Hollow Knight stops skipping rope with that line and instead uses it to hang the very concept of fun. I hate Godhome so much that even though it is free optional content, I wish I did not have it at all. Its very existence frustrates me to the point that I cannot say I love this game. To every lunatic out there who can overcome this legitimately, I salute you. To those who can do it without being hit, you are fucking insane! So, how do I not hate Hollow Knight? This game certainly has plenty of highs, but none of them reach a point where they completely outweigh the lows for me. Combine that with my inherent dislike of the genre it belongs to, and Hollow Knight should be a game that I hold in contempt. But I just can't bring myself to hate it. Something about this game draws me in like a moth to an open flame. A few hours in and something just clicked for me. Every collectible gathered, every boss defeated, every room explored, it all just scratched a very particular itch. I'm no Gerard, but I definitely have a bit of a completionist side to me, and approaching the sheer wealth of content this game provided as a checklist I needed to get through compelled me to see it through to the end. And for what it's worth, I'm glad I did. Hollow Knight is a game that surprised me. I wanted to try it just to see what all the fuss was about, fully expecting a fairly short gaming experience that I would hate from start to finish. But instead, I found myself getting absorbed into a massive glut of almost perfectly crafted gameplay and world building that made me realize the fuss was well warranted. Did this game completely reverse my opinions on Metroidvania and completely alter my entire worldview? Is this a game I'm going to return to again and again and again? Am I now aboard the hype train for Silksong? No. In fact, there's a very good chance that I'm never going to play this game again. Maybe I'll pick up Silksong years down the road, but as far as I'm concerned, Hollow Knight was a great experience marred by too many things that rubbed me the wrong way. So while I can now say I love a great deal about this game, it is a very conditional love. But with that said, I do believe it is an experience worth having. And if you have never played it for yourself, I strongly encourage that you at least give it a try. If someone like me can get a great deal of enjoyment out of it despite all my hangups, then it really must be something special. Though special doesn't always mean good for you, and I'm pretty sure this game is going to be included in the list of causes for my inevitable hypertension, so play at your own risk.